Welcome back. We're ending on the messy stuff. Fat loss, sleep, alcohol, hormones, and the price of chasing optimization. And honestly, this is where the whole conversation gets real because it stops being theory and starts being your actual life. Okay, first thing that hit me was this idea that people want fat loss, not just weight loss. That sounds obvious until you realize half the industry is selling scale drama. And the big point was that eating less matters more than people want to admit. Which is annoying because everybody wants the secret hack and not the boring answer. Right, but the twist is exercise helps a lot, just not mainly because of calories burned. It's more about insulin sensitivity and appetite signals, which is way less sexy than a workout ad. Nobody wants to hear, sleep more and stop eating like a raccoon. But that was basically the message. Sleep deprivation makes people insulin resistant, and that's a huge deal. So if your sleep is broken, your fat loss plan is kind of fighting uphill from the start. Which is brutal because sleep is the first thing people sacrifice when life gets chaotic. And stress sits right next to it, quietly ruining everything. That part was annoying because it sounded so simple and yet so hard. He basically said, high stress can block weight loss even if the diet looks perfect. So your clean eating spreadsheet can still get bullied by your nervous system. That is such a mean sentence, but yes. Then he broke weight loss into 3 levers, which I liked because it was actually usable. Calorie restriction, dietary restriction, and time restriction. Calorie restriction is the blunt instrument. Eat less overall. But he also said if you do that on junk food, you may suffer the whole way. Yeah, because your body still wants protein and nutrients, shockingly. The human body is rude like that. Then dietary restriction is basically every diet war ever. Paleo people, keto people, carnivore people, Mediterranean people, all yelling at each other. The point is that restricting food choices often makes people eat less. And that was where keto came up, which felt very familiar. Because the weight loss story was almost too perfect at first. Then reality hit when the modern world showed up with restaurants and a social life. That's the problem with extreme diets. They work until they meet Tuesday night. And then New York happened and the whole thing collapsed. Which is honestly the most relatable part of the whole story. Time restriction was the third lever, basically intermittent fasting. Shorter eating windows can create a deficit without obsessing over every bite. But he kept coming back to protein, which is the inconvenient truth. If you fast too aggressively, it gets harder to keep muscle. So the dream of being ripped and spiritually empty is not the plan. That's a very specific nightmare, but yes. Then alcohol came in and he did not romanticize it at all. He basically said ethanol is toxic, full stop. And the famous J-curve is likely confounded by bad data and weird survival effects. In other words, the graph may be lying with manners. That is a brilliant way to put it. His personal rules were actually interesting. Don't drink much, and don't drink close to bed. Because sleep gets wrecked and he thinks sleep is non-negotiable. That part I totally get because one bad drink can tank the whole next day. Your HRV just starts screaming at you like an over-caffeinated accountant. Exactly, and then you feel personally attacked by a wearable. Sleep was one of the strongest themes in the whole conversation. He came at it from evolution, which was clever. If sleep were useless, nature would have found a way to delete it. Instead, we all keep doing this weird unconscious third of life thing. And beyond survival, sleep connects to heart disease, dementia, insulin resistance, and weight gain. It's hard to argue with a list that ugly. Plus mood, creativity, and how sharp you sound in a room. That was the bit I liked most, because it wasn't only about living longer. It was also about functioning like yourself while you're alive. Then the hormone stuff got spicy fast. Testosterone replacement sounds simple until you hear the trade-offs. He was pretty positive about responsible TRT in men, but not casual about it. And for women, hormone therapy sounded even more misunderstood, especially with menopause symptoms, bone density, and quality of life. People hear hormone therapy and act like it's one giant panic button. But he made it sound like the real issue is bad, lazy, one-size-fits-all medicine. I thought the part about women having testosterone too was genuinely interesting. Not because everyone should take it, but because we flatten the conversation too much. And then, of course, hair loss enters the chat and everybody panics. That was the most honest part of the whole thing. People will accept almost anything except losing their hair or libido. Fair, honestly. The finasteride and dutasteride discussion was a good reminder that there is no free lunch. A drug can help the hairline and still come with scary sexual side effects. And for some people, those side effects may not fully go away. That's enough to make anyone cautious. His bigger philosophy was basically that every intervention has a cost. That felt like the real thread underneath everything. Food, sleep, alcohol, hormones, even supplements, all of it has trade-offs. Which is not a fun answer, but it is a grown-up answer. The grown-up answer is always rude. I also liked how he ended on the idea that his impact might mostly be on his kids. That was unexpectedly grounded. In a world obsessed with grand purpose, he chose something much smaller and stronger. Raise curious kids, raise well-adjusted kids, and that becomes your real legacy. It's almost annoyingly sane. And that was a great note to end this whole series on, honestly. We started with prevention and ended with the very personal stuff that prevention is really for. Because none of this is abstract when it's your sleep, your hormones, your stress, your habits, or your desperate attempts to outsmart a bad week. That too. Anyway, this was a strong finish to the series. Thanks for riding through all 4 episodes with us, and we'll catch you next time. Welcome back. This episode gets into the messy stuff. Weight loss, sleep, alcohol, hormones, and what optimization actually costs. And honestly, it feels less like biohacking and more like making peace with your own body. Wait, the calorie conversation was already spicy because people want shortcuts so badly. Everybody wants fat loss, but nobody wants the part where they stop eating like chaos. That is the most brutal way to say it, but it is true. The key point was that exercise matters, but sleep and stress can quietly wreck everything. That part really lands because people will blame the diet before they blame their life. Which is annoying because the life part is usually the actual problem. And then he breaks it into those 3 deficit strategies, which is such a clean framework. Calorie restriction, dietary restriction, and time restriction. 3 ways to suffer, basically. Not wrong, but calorie restriction is the most honest version. It's the least romantic, but it is the most direct. The interesting tension is that it works even if the food is terrible. Which is where people get weird, because technically you can eat pizza and lose weight. You can also be miserable and right at the same time. Exactly. And that's the part people skip when they say calories are all that matter. The body still wants nutrients, protein, fiber, and sleep, not just math. The celery example was funny because it exposed how sloppy people get with nutrition arguments. Celery has become the mascot for fake precision. People act like they're cracking nuclear codes when they're just counting carrots. But the bigger point was that not all calories are equal in practice, even if the equation matters. And then sleep comes in like the silent villain. Sleep always shows up late to the party and ruins the whole plan. If you're sleep deprived, you get more insulin resistant and hungrier. That's such a nasty combo because then the diet feels like it's failing you. And stress is even harder because it's hard to measure and easy to deny. People love saying they ate clean, as if cortisol was just standing outside politely. Imagine stress waiting in line like a normal customer. But that's what makes the prevention argument so strong, because behavior stacks over time. The fasting part was interesting too, because it sounded practical but not magical. He likes time restriction because it's easy to execute and hard to overcomplicate. But he also pushed back on fasting when protein and muscle preservation become the issue. That felt like the real adult answer, not the internet answer. The internet answer is always just starve harder and call it discipline. The adult answer is, how do you lose fat without becoming a weaker version of yourself? That's the whole philosophy in one sentence, honestly. And then alcohol came in and he basically said, this stuff is toxic. Which is rude but medically convenient. He was so calm about it too, like he was discussing paint thinner with a face. The point was that low doses may look harmless, but there's no real health upside. And that J-curve explanation is exactly why people get confused. Because the data can make moderate drinking look almost heroic if you don't inspect the bias. The non-drinker pool is messy, survivorship is messy, everything is messy. Basically, the study is not the bartender you think it is. Very few things in nutrition are as simple as the headline wants them to be. His personal rules were more interesting than the abstract theory, though. 1 drink max and not close to bedtime because sleep matters more. That's such a grown-up trade-off, like I can enjoy this if it doesn't wreck tomorrow. And the sleep wearables made it more real for him, not just philosophical. When your metrics turn red after one glass, the debate gets shorter. Your body basically files a complaint immediately. The sleep section might have been the strongest part because the evolutionary argument is so clean. If something has survived this long despite being inconvenient, it probably matters. And the idea that no species has really escaped sleep is kind of wild. Like every animal got the memo except us, and we still think we're above it. Humans really do believe they can outschedule biology. He also tied sleep to cardiovascular disease, dementia, insulin resistance, and performance. So even if you don't care about longevity, you still care about functioning tomorrow, which is usually how people start caring after they feel bad enough. Then the hormone conversation got very real, very fast. He was pretty clear that TRT and menopause treatment are often misunderstood. And he was also careful not to turn it into a blanket endorsement. At physiologic doses, testosterone in men can help body composition and insulin sensitivity. But he did not really pretend it was risk-free or casual, which is where people get reckless because they want enhancement without consequences. And then the fertility point lands like a brick. High doses can shut down natural production and sperm generation. That is the part nobody wants to hear when they're chasing abs or hairline rescue. The hair loss example was almost absurdly practical because it made the hidden cost obvious. Everyone wants the rescue package until the rescue package has side effects. That should be on a warning label somewhere. And for women, his point was that hormone replacement can be a net positive, especially for symptoms and bone health. The fact that testosterone matters for women too is one of those under-discussed things. It's not just about estrogen and progesterone, even though those dominate the conversation. The theme underneath all of this is really balance, not obsession. Like, how much intervention is enough before the intervention becomes the problem? That is the adult question nobody can outsource. He kept returning to the idea that there is no free lunch in physiology, which is deeply offensive to the human spirit, but true. People hate that sentence because it ends the fantasy immediately. And the closing question about AI was a left turn, but his answer was very human. He basically said his biggest impact is probably on his kids. That felt like a real reset from optimization back to actual purpose. Because the whole series has been about extending life, but also improving what life is for. And that's why this conversation worked so well, because it never lost the human scale. Prevention sounds clinical until you realize it is just a better daily life. It turns out the boring stuff is the revolutionary stuff. Exactly, and that's a pretty good place to end the whole series. If listeners take one thing from all 4 episodes, it should be that health is built, not discovered. And if they want to revisit the deeper questions, the book is the obvious place to go. That's the wrap from us, and honestly, this was a great run. We'll see you next time, and hopefully with fewer bad habits to confess. Welcome back. This one gets into prevention, sleep, alcohol, hormones, and the real cost of optimization. And honestly, this is where the whole thing stops sounding like medicine and starts sounding like life. The weight loss part alone was already a mess, because everybody wants fat loss but says weight loss. That distinction is annoying, but it matters a lot more than people admit. Because if you just slash calories, you can lose muscle and still call it success. And that is the trap, right? Where the scale looks better and the body is worse. What I liked was how he kept refusing the clean slogan version of it. Yeah, the body apparently does not care about our motivational posters. It really does not. It just keeps score in the ugliest possible way. Sleep, stress, inactivity, all of that sits under the weight story too. That part felt bigger than the diet advice, honestly. Because people will eat clean while living in chaos and then blame the broccoli. Broccoli catching strays in every health conversation is incredible. But he was right that poor sleep makes insulin resistance worse. And that makes fat loss harder even when the food looks perfect on paper. That was the punchline almost nobody wants, because it means the answer is not one hack. It is never one hack, and that is why people keep buying hacks. The market for fake simplicity is basically undefeated. The 3 strategies thing was useful, though. Calorie restriction, dietary restriction, and time restriction. It makes the whole conversation less mystical and more operational. But calorie restriction is still brutal if the food quality is terrible. Eating 2,000 calories of rubbish is technically a plan, I guess. It is a plan for suffering, which is still a plan. The keto story was interesting because it worked and still did not solve sustainability. That is the bit people skip when they brag about the before and after photo. The after is usually where reality walks in and steals the car. The New York diet just sounds like a scientific category of damage. But fasting was where I think a lot of listeners will lean in because it sounds elegant. It is elegant until protein enters the room and ruins the party. Protein is such a buzzkill, and also the reason your body still works. That trade-off matters, especially if the goal is losing fat without losing muscle. And then alcohol came in like this weird, socially acceptable toxin conversation. He was very direct that ethanol is toxic and the dose response is not friendly. I appreciated that he did not hide behind the cute version of the data. The cute version of the data is how people justify a second glass, or a third, or the tragic airport wine purchase. The airport drink being bad enough to count as punishment is such a real rule. But the sleep boundary was the most persuasive part to me. If alcohol wrecks sleep, then the next day cost is bigger than people think. And the wearable showing red and basically snitching on you is brutal. A device saying, "Did you drink last night?" feels like a tiny moral audit. Sleep had that evolutionary argument too, which I thought was really strong. Because when you say it out loud, being unconscious for a third of life sounds insane. Humans are weird enough without voluntarily turning off for that long. Yet every species has apparently agreed this is the price of admission. The cardio and dementia risk from bad sleep felt like the real wake-up call. But the emotional and performance piece might be even more practical day to day. If your mood and articulation collapse, your whole life gets less accurate. Less accurate is a devastating way to describe a tired human being. It is true, though, exhausted people become unreliable narrators of their own lives. Hormones were the other big turn because that topic always gets weird fast. He sounded measured about TRT, not evangelical, which I respected. The overprescribing part matters because people love shortcuts with medical branding. But the idea that responsible use can help body composition and insulin sensitivity is not nothing. Right. And the fertility warning is the part people ignore until it is too late. Imagine being told at 30 that your random optimization choice changed your future family plans. That is the kind of downside people never put in the glossy before and after. The menopause and estrogen conversation felt even more important, honestly. Especially because the bone density piece is such a concrete long-term benefit. And the fact that women also have meaningful testosterone was a good reminder. We really do act like biology only has one dramatic subplot at a time. The body is basically running 12 negotiations at once. The hair loss part was where the conversation got properly emotionally realistic. Because people say it is just hair, but then the sexual side effects are the real fear. And once you hear that some effects may not fully reverse, the caution makes sense. Suddenly the shampoo aisle starts looking like a high-stakes lab. It really does, which is why his default of do less was so relatable. I also liked how he framed his own caution as a cost question, not fear of science. That is the philosophical thread here, right? Every intervention has a price. Sometimes the price is visible, sometimes it hides in sleep, libido, or fertility. Which is annoying, because the hidden costs always arrive after the hype cycle. And that is probably the best final note for the whole series. Prevention sounds boring until you realize it is just fewer future emergencies. The messy truth is that health is not one decision, it is a pile of trade-offs. And if this series did anything, it made those trade-offs feel more human. So if people walk away a little more skeptical of shortcuts, that is a win. And maybe a little more protective of sleep, which is honestly the cheapest upgrade. That is the wrap from us, and this was a genuinely strong 4-part run. We will see you next time, and hopefully with fewer bad habits to defend. Welcome back. This final one gets into prevention, sleep, alcohol, and hormones. Basically, the whole mess of trying to stay healthy without becoming a robot. And honestly, that is where the conversation gets interesting. Because the first thing he does is ruin everyone's favorite weight loss shortcuts. Wait, water and sparkling water instead of diet soda was the move? That sounds suspiciously simple for a guy with a whole book. But his point was basically, the body notices more than the label. And the real theme here is that weight loss is never just calories. Which is annoying, because calories are the one thing people want to make tidy. Humans love pretending biology is a spreadsheet with better branding. Exactly, and then sleep walks in and steals the whole show. He keeps saying sleep deprivation makes you insulin resistant and hungrier, which means you can diet perfectly and still lose the fight. That part is brutal because it makes health look less like willpower and more like systems. And that is such an important shift because it takes the shame out of it. Like, maybe you are not broken, maybe you are just exhausted. Or stressed, which is the other sneaky villain everyone tries to ignore. He was very clear that high stress can make losing fat way harder. And that lines up with what people actually feel in real life, not just on paper. The funniest part is he broke weight loss into 3 levers like he was opening a toolbox. Calorie restriction, dietary restriction, and time restriction. Which sounds neat until you try to live like a normal person. Calorie restriction is the most direct, but also the most miserable if you do it badly. And the diet version is basically, pick your poison and remove it. Which is why keto works for some people and then explodes in New York. The city is basically a carbohydrate theme park. That is exactly the problem. It is impossible to sustain in a real social life. Then fasting comes in as the easiest concept, but not always the best trade-off. Because the protein issue becomes the annoying hidden cost. And muscle matters, which people forget when they get obsessed with the scale. That was one of the sharpest distinctions in the whole conversation. Fat loss versus weight loss. Then alcohol comes in and gets absolutely no mercy. He basically said, if it is not worth it, do not drink it. And I love how unsentimental he is about the J-curve stuff. He does not buy the cute idea that booze is secretly healthy, which is probably annoying if your personality is built around wine o'clock. But his rules are practical, like not drinking close to bed, because sleep gets wrecked and then everything else gets worse. That part felt very lived in, not preachy. He is basically saying your data should embarrass your excuses. If your sleep tracker turns red after one drink, that is a savage little mirror. Then the hormone section gets very real very fast. TRT sounds like a miracle until you hear the fertility part. That is the cost people never want to read in the small print. And for women, he was much more confident that hormone therapy is underused, especially when symptoms are obvious and bone health is on the line. The wild part is how much testosterone women actually have too. So the takeaway is not fear hormones, but respect them. And maybe do not let a random clinic become your chemist. That is a very expensive way to ruin your week or your decade. What I liked most is how he kept circling back to prevention as dignity. Not waiting for disease, not pretending symptoms are the first warning. Just accepting that the body gives clues years before the crisis. And that is the real series lesson for me. Health is not one heroic move, it is a bunch of boring good decisions. Annoying, yes, but also kind of liberating. Because once you stop chasing hacks, you start managing risk like an adult. Which is less sexy, but way more useful. And that feels like the right note to end on. Thanks for riding with us through the whole 4-part run. Go sleep, drink less, lift something heavy, and stop negotiating with biology. We will catch you on the next one.